On a wet Friday morning in late October, just before the first hard frost of the season had the chance to seal the mud, along the banks of the Culver River, a silver SUV belonging to a man named Dale Hutchins came to rest at the bottom of a 15-foot embankment nose down, buried to its front axle in the soft black riverbed. Nobody was hurt. That part, at least, was a mercy. Dale had swerved to avoid a deer, clipped the guardrail, and slid sideways down the slope in a slow, awful arc that he would describe for years afterward as feeling like the earth itself had reached up and taken hold of something it had decided to keep. He climbed out through the passenger window, soaking wet to the thigh, and stood on the bank in the pale morning light and looked at what used to be his $48,000 vehicle, now half swallowed by a river that had been eating this particular stretch of highway for the better part of 2 centuries. He called his insurance company. He called a towing service. He called his project manager because Dale Hutchins was not simply a man who had driven his car into a river. He was the man behind Hutchins Heavy Contracting, one of the 3 largest earth-moving operations in the county, a company that owned 11 excavators, 7 bulldozers, and a fleet of articulated dump trucks that could haul 60 tons of fill per load. He had moved mountains, not metaphorically, literally. He had relocated a hillside to build a distribution center and leveled a ridge to lay a natural gas pipeline, and he was not, he told himself as he stood dripping on the highway shoulder, going to be defeated by a muddy river and a deer. Let me tell you about Dale Hutchins. Dale was 47 years old, built like a man who had once done physical labor but had spent the last decade doing it by proxy. He wore steel-toed boots that had never seen steel, kept them polished to a mirror shine. He drove a company truck that cost more than most of his workers earned in a year, and he had a habit of arriving at job sites, clasping his hands behind his back and staring at the problem the way a general surveys a battlefield, which is to say, with the quiet, settled confidence of a man who already knows how it ends. He was not cruel, he was not dishonest, but he had arrived at that particular plateau of success where a man begins to confuse competence with omniscience, where the fact that he had solved every problem so far became, in his own mind, evidence that he was capable of solving every problem that would ever arise. His equipment was the best money could buy. He did not believe in old things. He believed in torque specs and load ratings and manufacturer warranties and dealer relationships. When someone on one of his crews mentioned that they used to do something a different way, the older way, the way their father had shown them, Dale would listen politely for about 4 seconds and then redirect the conversation to what was actually going to happen. He was not unkind about it. He just didn't see the point. The past was a place where people did things badly before they figured out how to do them well. Now let me tell you about the problem. The Culver River at that location was not wide, maybe 60 feet across at its broadest point, but the banks were steep and the bottom was the kind of deep, cold mud that forms over centuries of sediment and has the consistency and grip of wet cement. The SUV had come to rest with its front end pointing downstream, the nose submerged and the rear end rising at a 20-degree angle up the slope. The current was not violent, but it was steady, and with every hour that passed, the mud was pulling the vehicle deeper, redistributing the weight, packing itself into the wheel wells and the undercarriage with patient, geological persistence. By 9 in the morning, the first tow truck arrived. The driver took one look and called for backup. By 10:30, there were 2 heavy-duty recovery trucks on the bank, a combined pulling capacity of 80,000 pounds between them, and both operators shaking their heads in a way that Dale did not care for at all. They rigged their cables, they set their anchors, they applied load, carefully at first, then with more authority. The cables went bar tight, humming with stored energy, and the SUV didn't move, not an inch. The mud, sensing the challenge, simply gripped harder. By noon, Dale had called in his own equipment. He had a long-reach excavator on a flatbed inside of 3 hours, a $200,000 machine with a reach of nearly 60 feet, and a bucket force that could peel the top off a small hill. They set it up on the opposite bank, worked the bucket under the front end of the vehicle, and pushed upward with everything the machine had. Let me tell you about the next 4 hours, because they matter. They snapped 2 chains. They bent a recovery anchor. They moved so much earth around the vehicle trying to create a workable angle that the bank looked like a construction site. The excavator operator, a 20-year veteran named Cody, a man Dale trusted more than almost anyone he employed, climbed out of the cab around 4 in the afternoon with the expression of a man who has discovered a new and humbling limit to his capabilities. And he said, "Dale, I don't know what else to try. That mud has set up around it, like concrete. Every time we get purchase on one end, we lose it on the other. She's going deeper, not shallower." Dale stood on the bank, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at the river. The sun was already low, October being what it is in that part of the country, and the light had gone that flat, copper color that made everything look a little bit like defeat. He had spent close to $8,000 in equipment time, fuel, and labor. The SUV was now visibly deeper than it had been when the day started. He did not say anything for a long time, and that was unusual for Dale Hutchins. Now let me tell you about the man who appeared the next morning. At 7:30, just as Dale and his crew were reassembling on the bank, with fresh eyes and a rented hydraulic winch system that a specialist from the city had driven 2 hours to operate, they heard it before they saw it. A sound from up the highway, from the direction of the old county road that cut north through the fields, a sound that did not belong to any piece of modern equipment, and that Cody would later describe as a tractor that had learned to think. It was a clanking, rhythmic, unhurried sound. Not a rattle, not a mechanical complaint, just a deep, even deliberate percussion like something very heavy being turned over and over by something very patient. It got louder, and then around the bend it came into view. Let me tell you about Walter Briggs. Walter was 79 years old. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who has never felt the need to fill a room with movement because the room already knows he is there. He had farmed the same 300 acres on the north side of the valley his entire life, the same land his grandfather had broken with a team of oxen in the early part of the previous century. And he knew every drainage ditch, every low field, every creek crossing, and every mud bottom in a 10-mile radius in the same way a man knows the layout of his own house in the dark. He did not attend town meetings to complain. He did not write letters to the county. When something needed doing, he either did it or he decided it was not his business to do. He watched the recovery efforts on the culvert from his north fence line the previous afternoon, and he watched them the way he watched weather, which is to say, without urgency, but with complete attention. That evening, at the kitchen table, he had looked at a photograph on the wall, a photograph of his father standing next to a piece of equipment in a field somewhere, and he had decided that it was his business after all. He arrived driving the tractor. Dale Hutchins looked at it. He looked at it the way you look at something that surprises you, not pleasantly. It was a 1952 Oliver Super 88, a row crop tractor from the era before most of the men on that bank had been born. It was the color it had always been, a deep, oxidized red with green accents that had mostly faded to something between sage and gray. It was not small. The rear tires were massive, wide-lugged agricultural tires that stood nearly as tall as a man, and the engine, visible through the side panels, was a broad 6-cylinder diesel that had been rebuilt at some point, though not recently, and not by anyone trying to make it look like it had been rebuilt. The hydraulic attachment on the rear was a custom-fabricated winching rig, a spool of heavy steel cable wound onto a drum that looked like it had been welded together by someone who cared more about whether it would hold than about whether it would photograph well. There was a block and tackle pulley assembly laid across the hood and a second spool on the front hitch that Dale didn't understand the function of, not yet. Walter climbed down from the cab. He did it slowly, the way old men climb down from tractors, with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned over time that the ground is always there and rushing to meet it solves nothing. He looked at the river. He looked at the SUV. He looked at the cables, the excavator, the hydraulic winch rig, the bent anchor, and the general atmosphere of expensive, competent failure. Then he looked at Dale. "Saw your problem yesterday," Walter said. "Think I might be able to help." Dale looked at the tractor. He looked at the old man, and then he laughed, not cruelly, not intentionally. It was the laugh that comes out of a man when his brain produces a response that bypasses the filter of social grace, the laugh that says, without saying, "I cannot believe you are serious." "No disrespect, sir," Dale said, which was already a complicated thing to say after laughing. "But we've had 80,000 pounds of pull on that truck and it hasn't budged. I don't think a tractor from the Eisenhower administration is going to change that calculus." Walter nodded slowly. He had been nodded at like that before. "Your equipment is fast," Walter said. "Fast equipment is built to move things that are already loose. What you've got down there isn't loose. What you've got is set, and you can't yank something set. You have to ease it out. Slow, continuous pull, not shock load. Your winch trucks and your excavator, they apply peak load and release. Peak load and release. Every time you do that, you let the mud seal back up. What you need is something that pulls and never stops pulling, that doesn't know how to stop, that just keeps asking the mud to let go over and over and over until the mud gets tired of saying no." Dale stared at him. Cody, standing to the left, had stopped doing what he was doing. "And that tractor does that," Dale said. And he did not entirely keep the skepticism out of his voice. "She does one thing," Walter said. "She pulls. That's all she's ever done. She doesn't have a mood. She doesn't have a limit she's aware of. You set the load, you engage the drum, and she works until the job is done or something breaks. In 60 years of using her, nothing has ever broken. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room, or on a riverbank, or in a meeting, or in any situation at all where the most qualified person present was the one everyone was least inclined to listen to? Where the answer was standing right in front of you and you couldn't see it because you'd already decided what the answer was supposed to look like? I want you to hold that question because it is the beating heart of what happened next. Let me tell you about that tractor. The Oliver Super 88 was purchased in the spring of 1952 by Walter's father, Harold Briggs, a practical man who had spent 2 years saving for it and who had driven to the dealership in the county seat with the cash money folded in his shirt pocket. The tractor cost $2,100, which in 1952 was approximately the value of a modest house in that county, and Harold paid it without negotiation because he had done his research and he knew what he was buying. He was buying a machine that had been designed not for a showroom or a trade publication, but for the specific, unforgiving conditions of heavy agricultural work in difficult ground. The Super 88 was the year that Oliver introduced their 6-cylinder diesel engine, a 90-horsepower unit that was considered exceptionally powerful for its time. But it was not the horsepower that Harold Briggs had paid for. It was the torque. At peak, that engine produced over 250 foot-pounds of torque, and it delivered it not in a spike, not in a burst, but in a long, rolling, uninterrupted curve that allowed the drivetrain to convert nearly all of it into pulling force at the drawbar without the shock loads that snapped chains and popped anchors. The custom winch rig had been fabricated by Harold himself in the winter of 1958, after a neighboring farmer's combine became trapped in a flooded field, and the conventional wisdom of the county proved insufficient to retrieve it. Harold solved that problem in 4 hours with cable, pulleys, and patience. He built the winch rig the following winter, so that the next time it would take 2 hours instead of 4. Walter had used that rig to pull a cement truck out of a sinkhole in 1971. He had used it to recover a school bus that slid off a county road in a snowstorm in 1983. He had used it quietly and without publicity on perhaps a dozen occasions over the decades when something heavy had gone. Somewhere heavy, things should not go, and every time the machine had done what it did, it pulled. It did not stop. It did not spike and release. It applied its load with the patient, grinding persistence of something that had been built before planned obsolescence was invented. Dale Hutchins listened to all of this, standing on a riverbank in the morning cold, and somewhere around the part about the cement truck and the sinkhole. His laugh had finished dying and had not been replaced by anything except attention. "What do you want if it works?" Dale asked. Walter considered this. "There's a museum over in Harker County, old farm equipment mostly. They've been trying to restore a 1938 Oliver 70 for 3 years, and they can't find anyone who knows the fuel system well enough to finish the job. Donation of $500 would let them bring in the right person." Dale Hutchins, a man who spent $5,000 on client dinners without deliberation, stared at this old man who had just offered to attempt something that 2 professional recovery teams and $20,000 of specialized equipment had been unable to accomplish, and had asked for the right to donate $500 to a tractor museum if it worked. "And if it doesn't work?" Dale said. "Then you've lost an hour," Walter said. Dale looked at Cody. Cody looked back at him with the expression of a man who does not have a better suggestion. "All right," Dale said, "let me tell you about the setup." Walter did not hurry. This was the first thing that the assembled crew noticed, and it was the thing that made some of them quietly uneasy, because they were men of the modern construction world, where time is money and motion is evidence of productivity. Walter Briggs moved around the site the way water moves around a rock, with complete purposefulness and without any apparent urgency, and every action he took was a decision that had been made before he made it. He walked the bank for 20 minutes, looking at the angle of the vehicle, the slope of the embankment, the position of the front axle, the direction of the current. He crouched twice to look at the mud around the rear tires, pressing his palm flat against it and reading something there that he did not explain aloud. He looked at the trees on the far bank, the largest ones, assessing them with the kind of look a structural engineer gives to a load-bearing wall. Then he went to the tractor and began. The block and tackle pulley system came off the hood. He set a steel anchor stake into the solid clay of the bank with a hand sledge, 3 blows, each one deliberate and measured. He ran the primary cable from the winch drum down the slope at a specific angle, not straight back from the vehicle, but at a 12-degree offset from the center line, which he established with a length of rope and a simple geometry that he carried in his head. He explained, to nobody in particular, that the SUV had been pulled at directly from behind by every previous attempt, which had created a suction seal against the forward-most submerged surface. Pulling off axis would introduce a rotational force component that would begin to break that seal rather than fight it directly. Cody watched this explanation happen and then stood very still for a moment. The pulley block went around the base of a large oak on the far bank. The cable fed through it, adding a mechanical advantage that multiplied the tractor's effective pulling force by a factor of 3. Combined with the long, continuous nature of the pull, the actual force being applied to the vehicle, Walter explained, would exceed anything the winch trucks had managed, but it would exceed it slowly, the way a tide exceeds a shoreline, not the way a hammer exceeds a nail. By the time the setup was complete, an hour and 40 minutes had passed. Some of Dale's crew had drifted back to their trucks for coffee. Dale had not moved. He stood on the bank and watched with his hands in his pockets and did not say a single word. And this, if you knew Dale Hutchins, was the surest possible sign that something had his full attention. Walter climbed back into the cab. The engine had been idling the whole time, a deep, unhurried sound, steady as a heartbeat, and now Walter engaged the PTO, the power takeoff that drove the winch drum, and set the drum to its slowest possible speed. The cable, which had been hanging slack in the river, began to come taut. Let me tell you about the next 22 minutes. That is how long it took. 22 minutes from the moment the cable went taut to the moment the SUV came free of the river. And in those 22 minutes, nothing dramatic happened. Nothing snapped, nothing groaned catastrophically, nothing moved fast enough to see if you were not looking carefully. The tractor pulled, the drum turned, the cable remained taut. At 4 minutes, one of the crew members said, "Nothing's happening," and Walter, from inside the cab, heard him and did not respond. At 9 minutes, Cody crouched at the water's edge and looked at the mud around the rear quarter panel of the SUV, and he stood up and said very quietly, "It's moving." It was moving, not fast, not visibly fast, but it was moving the way a glacier moves, the way a door opens when the hinge is stiff. The mud was releasing, not all at once, not in the dramatic, explosive surrender that a shock load demands. It was releasing the way mud releases when something just keeps asking it to, 1 millimeter at a time, pressure unrelenting, the seal breaking along its perimeter in a slow, patient circumference. At 14 minutes, the front end of the SUV was visibly rising in the water. At 18 minutes, the current caught the loosening vehicle and tried to push it sideways, and Walter, without breaking the engine rhythm, made a small adjustment to the cable angle that accounted for this exactly, and the SUV continued its slow, inexorable journey toward the bank. At 22 minutes, the front tires broke the surface. At 22 minutes, and some seconds after that, with a long sucking sound that the mud made when it finally gave up the argument, the vehicle came clear of the riverbed and sat on the bank slope, dripping and intact. Dale's crew erupted. They were young men, most of them, and they had spent 2 days on this bank, and they had not expected this, and their relief came out of them the way relief comes out of young men, loudly and completely. They cheered, they slapped each other. Cody stood with his hands on top of his head and stared at the recovered vehicle with the expression of a man revising his education. Dale Hutchins stood very still. Then from inside the cab, Walter engaged the old air horn. It was a proper agricultural air horn from 1952, and it made a sound that was nothing like the electronic chirps and beeps of modern equipment. It was a long, low, resonant note that rolled down the river valley and bounced off the far bank and the tree line beyond, and it sounded in that moment less like a signal and more like a declaration. It sounded like something that had been waiting 70 years to say, "I told you so." Dale Hutchins didn't speak that day. Not about what mattered. He paid his crew, he arranged for the SUV to be winched the rest of the way up the bank by conventional means, and he drove home, and he sat in his kitchen and stared at the table for a long time. The next morning, he drove north on the county road. Let me tell you about the visit. Walter Briggs's farm was the kind of property that announced itself as serious long before you reached the buildings. The fence lines were maintained, the drainage ditches were clear, the fields, now fallow for the season, had the neat, unambiguous edges of ground that is worked by someone who understands it. The barn was a structure that had been repaired continuously for at least 60 years, which meant it looked neither old nor new, just enduring, which is what a barn is supposed to look like. The tractor was parked in the barn, clean now, wiped down, cable respooled with the neat, even tension of a man who puts his tools away properly because he intends to use them again. Walter was in the workshop at the back of the barn doing something with a piece of agricultural machinery that Dale didn't recognize when Dale arrived. He looked up. He did not seem surprised. Dale stood in the barn doorway for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for laughing." Walter set down his tool. He considered Dale with the patient, unambiguous gaze of a man who has been laughed at before and has long since stopped being wounded by it. "You laughed because you've spent your career learning that new is better," Walter said. "That's not a character flaw. That's the world you work in. The problem is when you stop asking whether it's true." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How does it do what it does? I've been thinking about it since yesterday. My machines have more power." "More power isn't the same as more useful force," Walter said. "Your machines are built for speed. Speed requires a different kind of drivetrain, a different power delivery. Speed equipment spikes. This engine," he patted the hood of the Oliver, "was built for drawbar work, for pulling. The power delivery is tuned to stay in the load range, not to peak above it and drop off. And the winch-drum ratio means it converts that continuous power into continuous cable tension. No spike, no release, just a steady, unchanging ask. You can't build a stronger argument by yelling louder. You just have to keep making it." Dale looked at the tractor for a long moment. He wrote the check for $500 to the Harker County Agricultural Heritage Museum. Then he wrote a second check for $4,500 and handed both to Walter. "The first one's the wager," he said. "The second one's for what I should have paid a consultant who spent 2 days teaching me something I should have already known." Walter looked at the second check for a long moment. "Put it in the name of the museum," he said. "They're good people." Let me tell you about the years that followed. Dale Hutchins did not become a different person overnight. Transformation is not a moment, it's a direction, and what the Culver River gave him was a direction. He started asking different questions on job sites, not just what is the most powerful tool for this, but what is the right tool. And those are not always the same question, and the difference between them is often where experienced men separate from merely successful ones. He called Walter twice more in the next 5 years, both times about problems that his modern equipment was producing without solving, and both times Walter drove the Oliver to the site in that unhurried way, set up his cables and pulleys with that unhurried patience, and did the work. The second time, Dale watched the setup and asked questions throughout, and Walter answered them. And it was a different kind of education than Dale had ever received, the kind that comes from someone who doesn't have a curriculum, just knowledge, and who teaches by doing rather than presenting. Walter Briggs became, in the years following the Culver River event, a figure of quiet local legend. Not because he sought it, but because stories have a way of traveling in counties where people still talk to each other, and the story of the old farmer and the 1952 tractor pulling out the contractor's SUV when every modern machine had failed was a good story, which meant it got told and it got told and it got told. He was called upon 3 more times in the next decade for recovery jobs that nobody else could manage, 2 of them heavy equipment, and 1 of them a stone foundation section that had to be repositioned without disturbing the structure above it. He never charged for the attempt. He always named a donation to the museum, and the donation always seemed too small for what he'd done, and the people who received his help always gave more than he'd asked for. He turned 87 in the April of the 11th year after the Culver River morning, and the people who knew him threw him a small party in the church hall, and Dale Hutchins came and the two men shook hands and sat next to each other at a table and ate cake. And Dale told the story of the river to a group of young men who hadn't heard it, and Walter sat beside him listening to himself become a legend, which he did with the same equanimity he brought to everything else. Walter Briggs passed away in the early winter of the 14th year after the Culver River, on a morning not unlike the one on which the whole story had begun. He went quietly, in the way that men who have spent their lives in deliberate motion tend to go, with the same lack of drama that had characterized everything he did. His son, Thomas Briggs, who had grown up watching his father work and had learned the winch rig and the pulley geometry and the engine character of the Oliver Super 88 over 30 years of standing beside the man and paying attention, was with him. The funeral was attended by a considerable portion of the county, which surprised no one who knew what kind of man Walter Briggs had been. Dale Hutchins was there, in the second row, and he sat with his hands folded and stared straight ahead for most of it, and when it was over he stood at the grave for a time, after most of the others had gone, not saying anything, just standing the way you stand when you are in the presence of a debt that cannot be fully paid, and you want at least to acknowledge it. Thomas Briggs kept the tractor. He kept it the way his father had kept it, maintained and capable, the cable drum respooled with that same neat tension, the block and tackle in its place across the hood. He knew the machine the way his father had known it, from the inside out, from the specific tone the engine made when the drawbar load was approaching its ideal range, to the particular sequence of adjustments required in cold weather to coax the diesel to life without straining the starting system. And in the spring of the 17th year after the Culver River morning, Thomas Briggs heard from a neighbor about a problem down by the lower creek crossing on the Darrow Road, where a piece of heavy construction equipment had slipped off a temporary access road and was embedded in a clay deposit that was behaving, according to the operators and recovery specialists on site, like wet concrete. Let me tell you about who had sent that equipment. His name was Marcus Hutchins. He was Dale's son, 26 years old, fresh from a civil engineering program, running his first major independent job for the family company. He had his father's energy and his father's confidence, and, as yet, something that takes time and a specific kind of experience to acquire, which is the humility to know when your confidence is warranted and when it is simply the echo of past success in a situation that has not yet asked you the hard question. Marcus had been on that bank for most of 2 days. He had tried 2 heavy recovery trucks and a hydraulic pulling frame he'd rented from a specialist. None of it had moved the machine more than a few inches before the anchors dragged or the cables overloaded. He was standing at the edge of the bank in the late afternoon light, looking at the stuck machine with his hands in his pockets, looking, without knowing it, exactly the way his father had looked at a river 14 years earlier when he heard a sound from up the road. It was a deep, rhythmic, unhurried clanking, not a rattle, not a complaint. Marcus Hutchins turned, and coming around the bend in the county road, in that same oxidized red and faded green, moving at the same deliberate pace with which it had moved for the better part of 7 decades, was a 1952 Oliver Super 88. At the wheel sat a man in his early 50s, unhurried, with the settled stillness of someone who already knows how it ends. Thomas Briggs pulled the tractor to the verge and climbed down slowly, because there is a right way to climb down from a tractor, and it doesn't involve rushing, and he looked at the clay bank and the stuck machine and the assembled recovery equipment, and he looked at Marcus Hutchins. "Heard you had a problem," he said. "Think I might be able to help?" Marcus looked at the tractor. He looked at the man, and then he laughed. It was the same laugh, the same involuntary, filter-bypassing response to the gap between what you expect the answer to look like and what the answer actually looks like. Marcus was 26 and competent, and full of the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been conclusively surprised. Thomas Briggs looked at him. He had seen this laugh before. He had watched his father receive this laugh at least 4 times, had stood beside him in the barn on the winter evening after the Culver River when Dale Hutchins drove up the county road to apologize, had listened to his father explain the distinction between power and useful force, between speed and application, between the machine that peaks and the machine that endures. He waited for the laugh to finish. Then he said, "Your father called mine a museum piece once, on a riverbank about 14 years ago." He paused. "You want to tell me how that story ended, or would you rather I just showed you?" Marcus Hutchins stopped laughing. There was a long moment. "Show me," he said. Thomas nodded. He went to the hood and lifted the block and tackle pulley assembly. He began walking the bank, looking at angles, reading the clay, pressing his palm to the ground in the way his father had taught him, and that his father's father had discovered, taking in information that does not appear in any engineering manual because it is the kind of knowledge that only accumulates through decades of doing the specific thing. The setup took just under 2 hours. The pull took 19 minutes. When the machine came free, the sound it made releasing from the clay was the same sound Dale Hutchins had heard on the Culver River, that long, reluctant, finally defeated exhalation of mud that has been holding on as long as it can and has simply run out of argument. Thomas Briggs engaged the air horn. That same low, resonant note rolled down the creek valley and echoed off the tree line, and Marcus Hutchins, standing on the bank with his mouth slightly open and his prior certainties in visible disarray, heard something in that sound that was not just a signal. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built